Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Southwest Climate Podcast. My name is Gigi Owen. I'm here with my colleague, Christina Green. And say hello, Christina.
Hello, everyone.
So we have taken over this episode to bring you three special guests. They were all part of the CLIMAS Environment and Society Fellowship Program over the past year. So a lot of the science that CLIMAS researchers do is done collaboratively with and for our community partners, so that the science that we do ends up being useful to decision making and policy development and planning. And so our fellowship program offers University of Arizona graduate students the opportunity to take this kind of collaborative approach to address environmental and societal problems. Our fellows are here today to share more about their work and what they've been up to over the past year. First up, we have Hannah Friedrich, a PhD candidate in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment at the University of Arizona. And I should say all our fellows this year are pursuing doctorates in geography. But Hannah has spent most of this year in Lake Charles, Louisiana, investigating hurricane recovery and what that has looked like and been like for residents in that region. So welcome, Hannah.
Thanks, Gigi. It's great to be here.
Next, we have Marley Lister, our second PhD candidate in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment. Over the past year, Marley has been diving into historical archives to analyze U.S. government documentation of Diné lands from the 1930s and land management policies and practices that resulted from some of those land surveys. Welcome, Marley.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be doing podcast again.
And our third guest is Lucas Billery, our third PhD candidate in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment. Lucas works in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas on issues of flooding and combining flood data from satellite imagery with experiences that residents have been having with flooding in that region. Welcome, Lucas.
Hey y'all, excited to be here.
So we'd like to hear more from each of you to provide a richer description of your work. So really, what have you been up to? Where have you been? And who have you been working with over the past year? And we'll start with you, Hannah.
Okay, yeah. So what I've been up to the past year, really since September, has been spending time here in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is in southwestern Louisiana, so on the other side of the state from New Orleans, which gets most of the attention when we think about what hurricanes look like and what hurricane recovery can entail. And I've been here because in fall 2020, the area was struck by two Category 4 hurricanes that struck kind of back to back to one another. And kind of in the wake of those two events, there's been a really, as in, a lot of large disasters, this kind of longer term recovery process that unfolds, that households face many challenges in terms of getting appropriate resources and financial monies together to repair the damages and stitch their lives back together. And yeah, what really drew me to this area is this kind of ongoing recovery that's been happening since the storms and the variation in people's experiences dealing with recovery. So most of what I've been doing here in Lake Charles is interviewing residents, talking about kind of having them walk me through what they dealt with from Hurricanes Laura and Delta and the various resources that they drew upon. One thing I've been really focusing on is how folks are using insurance to either help or not help their ability to recover. And that has been really illustrative of kind of the larger crises that are happening across the nation in terms of insurance companies pulling out of really high-risk areas and what impact that is having on households to recover from previous events and prepare for future storms. So I've been collaborating with a bunch of different community organizations that have, existing relationships and contacts with people here in Southwest Louisiana. So that's been really helpful to connect with people and, just gain better context of what's happening with people's inability to recover here.
Thanks. And I know a big part of the work that you've been doing too is then looking at satellite imagery. And can you talk a little bit more about that and the satellite to the ground kind of interactions that you've been having?
Yeah. So the kind of other part of my project is using remotely sensed satellite imagery to map when blue tarps get put on homes. So for those who aren't familiar, after a hurricane comes through and damages roofs and homes, oftentimes people will put a blue tarp on or any colored tarp on their home to kind of act as a band-aid until the roof can be repaired. And it just so happens that you can see these tarps from space using satellite imagery. And it's been used in a couple of different other studies to look at tracking rates of recovery over time. But the approach that I'm taking is a bit more finer grained and looking at kind of the both temporal longevity of these tarps on homes to look at disparities in recovery rates. So we can see that, using this type of data that, okay, this neighborhood on average is recovering 3 months faster than this neighborhood. And how does that compare to, average median household income and race and ethnicity and homeownership rates? So it can be a really useful tool to understand who's recovering and who's not recovering and what those disparities kind of look like from a spatial and temporal perspective. Perhaps I'll add that one of the really interesting things that's come out of the interviews and how it kind of connects to the satellite part of the work is that one of the questions I've been asking people is, what does a blue tarp mean to you? And does it signify recovery? Because, I can make a somewhat there's an assumption that a blue tarp equals ongoing recovery, that these homes haven't been repaired. But speaking to people, it's been really interesting to learn that kind of just the processes that go on in the steps of how a blue tarp fits into the larger rebuilding of a home. So because a blue tarp or a roof is often the first thing that does get repaired when a home is damaged, the tarp will come off first, but that doesn't mean that the inside of the home is repaired. Or that all damages have been addressed. So the interviews have been really informative to learning how incomplete of an indicator blue tarps are for recovery and are kind of this really single facet of the recovery process. And that's been really helpful to kind of contextualize and ground that the satellite maps of blue tarps are just, one part of the puzzle in terms of understanding what recovery looks like.
Yeah, I was gonna hop in really quick and ask you a question about the meaning of recovery. My research is similar in a sense of asking Dene people how they understand recovery after a 40-year land ban or development ban. And I was curious if, in your experience, recovery held the same meaning amongst the people you were talking to, or if there were just differences.
Yeah, I'm curious how you're using the term in your research, Marley. I've thought about this definition of what is recovery, what is it not, how do you measure it? And I think there's a lot of competing understandings of what recovery is. Sometimes it just means you go back to baseline of what you were before some kind of intervention or disturbance. Other instances of it are maybe you're excelling and you're actually in a better situation than where you were before an event happened, or, you could be in a worse off situation. And all of these have kind of led me to the understanding that recovery is there's no singular definition of what it looks like or who's kind of the poster child of recovery, but that it ultimately just transforms a place in a community. And that going back to that baseline, oftentimes, especially in a case like a hurricane setting, isn't usually a good outcome. And so we have to think a little bit more expansively about what recovery, normatively should look like.
One thing that came up while you were talking too is just really these assumptions we have as researchers and, kind of oh, this is what a blue tarp means. But then actually talking with people about what that means can really change our whole analysis and all of our research findings and what kinds of implications those can have. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting experience that you've been having and kind of having people tell you what their meanings of recovery are. That's a good segue over to Marley's work. Marley, talk a little bit about what you've been up to, and if you want to expand on what recovery has meant for you, that would be really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. So for the last year, my work has been a lot of historical archival data, and the reason I chose these land management reports is because my dissertation has to do with examining, and I use the term recovery because that's what's in the government memo and working papers that are put out of the community that I'm looking to, yeah, I guess study, and that is the former Bennett Freeze area. And this area has been afflicted by a 40-year development ban in which Dene people were unable to build infrastructure, update their houses, and get the necessary infrastructure. And so since 2009, there have been attempts to quote unquote recover or to rehabilitate or yeah, to pretty much issue development. And in this case, from those documents that I'm referring to, a lot of the time it's like job creation, housing infrastructure, plumbing and water, electricity. It's something I experienced growing up, not really having access to, and so we had to do a lot of water hauling. And as part of that dissertation, I'm always interested in historicizing questions about development and land, and part of that to me required looking at how that particular community's relationship to land was studied and documented, and how those questions, usually technical questions about development, are historically informed, but also find, I guess, an afterlife in the current situation. And so, yeah, I spent some time in the U of A special collections looking for documents, and thankfully there were four reports that range from engineering to land, range management studies. And so I've been working with Dene Soil and Water Conservation District members in analyzing it, but also trying to make use of these documents for Dene in our current communities. And one of those communities being my dissertation area of study. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it's been trying to make this information accessible, but also understanding how these particular documents may inform development currently. And that's been one of the more interesting things. Recently, I was able to host a community meeting where we presented on the management reports for my community, and a lot of interesting community comments about people not knowing about this history, but also the mapping of development projects that were proposed actually reflected later development projects. And they were wondering, and they're asking me if I knew if these were the projects. And I couldn't really entirely tell them if it was connected or not, because the projects that were proposed, there was no indication that they were approved or if they were fleshed out. It's not fleshed out, but implemented. And so there's definitely a disconnect there, but a lot of the community members were linking the 1930s land management reports to their contemporary issues of the former Bennett Freeze area. So, yeah, and so, yeah, recovery, even though we didn't really discuss recovery in these meetings, the comments reflected the contemporary issues of recovery for the former Bennett Freeze area. And one example being, in these reports, the community that we were presenting in was designated as potentially an agricultural site. And a lot of people afterwards came up to me and said, we could make this an agricultural site. We have plumbing now. Is this something, that could be done, as if I'm going to be able to initiate this? But and definitely reflecting a little bit of my positionality as a researcher. So yeah, just to summarize, it's just been, me doing a lot of archival work and then working with Dene community members in presenting and making that information accessible, which has opened a lot of opportunities for working with people as well who are like very knowledgeable of this issue.
Thanks, Marley. Can you give just a little bit more background on that development ban and what were like some of the assumptions that went into it? What was kind of the time frame? And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the former Bennett Freeze area was a product of the Navajo land dispute. And for 40 years, in the 1960s, I think I want to say 1966, all the way up until 2009 when it was officially lifted, Navajo people in this contested area were unable to build any permanent structures because the land was disputed and it might alter the claims made about the land. And so for a while, it's something I experienced growing up is just, hauling your own water, investing in a gas powered generator for electricity. And so since 2009, a lot of these communities, there's about nine of them, nine Dene communities that are working with the Navajo government on various levels, as well as NGOs in a project called Navajo Thaw. And so there's a lot of assumptions built into what the land should be used for and how development should be implemented and to what goals. And one of those goals being an emphasis on job creation and infrastructure development, and something that's a little bit more like held like land productivity. So and that land productivity of like value and whatnot, it reflects a lot of what was in the 1930s reports about the productivity of land use, certain land use, as well as livestock. So yeah, that's the more contemporary history of the communities where these land management reports were conducted.
Well, I would like to have Lucas talk about your project as well. I know there's also elements of recovery in the work that you're doing. But yeah, what have you been up to and where have you been?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's so interesting just sort of hearing Marley and Hannah speak because there's so many, I think, connections between my work and theirs. So my work focuses on flood vulnerability, environmental racism in informal communities in South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, and northeastern Mexico, namely Matamoros and Reynosa. And we think of these sort of informal communities we refer to as colonias, and the US side are colonias populares. On the Mexican side of the border, we think we have some similar sort of conditions in terms of lack of basic infrastructure, housing, running water. And I think similarly, I think to Hannah's work, this sort of issue of the repeat flooding, repeat issues with hazards, whether that be heat or pollution, or of course, or in my context, flooding is what I specifically focus on. So I spent the last year or so working with sort of a coalition of community-based organizations that have been doing this work for decades. And I think the real sort of big question that we're sort of trying to answer in this research project, which is called Flujos. Flujos is a dinámica that makes up the acronym Flood Justice Utilizing Satellite Observation, and also sort of means flows in Spanish, and sort of thinking about that as a sort of way of sort of thinking through the flow of knowledge. So sort of thinking through how we can center people's lived experiences when it comes to producing quantitative geographic knowledge. So in this particular instance, mapping floods. Really, what does it mean to sort of map a flood, and how might that be supporting existing advocacy efforts for these community-based organizations? So yeah, I've been doing that work for about a year. Yeah, I'll pause there for any questions.
I was curious about this question that you mentioned about how do we map floods. Is that something that you proposed, or is that something maybe the community members, when you're interacting with them, asked you, or through dialogue with one another? I was really curious about that.
Yeah, great question, Marley. Thanks for thinking for it. Yeah, this work really comes out of my master's thesis, which was really focused, which is really 2018, 2019, and at the beginning of 2020, where I was working with these community-based organizations, and at that point, it was really focused on this idea of sort of post-flood survival. So not really recovery, but really what does it mean in sort of the days, weeks, and months after a flood event? For folks to sort of to live day to day, and what kinds of things if folks have to resort to, in particular, looking at predatory loans, predatory sort of payday and car title lenders. And then working with community-based organizations at that point, they really spoke to this idea that while they've been trying to bring needed flood mitigation infrastructure, they're really hindered by a lack of data. They're really hindered by not actually knowing even the extent to which floods are happening just a few miles down the road. In the huge swaths of the Texas-Mexico border, there is no digitized FEMA floodplain data, for example, and there are very few stream gauges, which are sort of some traditional ways that we've used to measure floods and flood impacts, at least in the context of the U.S. And so this really came from the community partners themselves, these community-based organizations, sort of wanting to know how they could leverage geospatial data, namely flood data, flood extent data, to bring needed infrastructure. And so I think for us, the project is very much derived from this need that they have sort of stated repeatedly. And I think there's this sort of much bigger question that I'm still grappling with around what does it mean then to sort of produce a map politically? What does it mean then to have that geospatial data be used as a source of truth when you've got folks who have been giving sort of what we say testimonios, which is not just testimonies, but like a collective knowledge on the fact that they've been, experiencing floods repeatedly. What does it mean when those narratives are largely being disregarded by the state, whether that be the local government, the state of Texas, Conagua, which is sort of the national federal agency in Mexico? What happens when those narratives are being dismissed, and what does it then mean to have geospatial quantitative data be a source of truth that folks take seriously, right? What kinds of epistemologies are we valuing? Which is something that I'm still grappling with, and was not something that something that was in the back of my head all of this last year, but something that I'm really taking forward into next year.
I asked that because the land management reports that I presented on, some people were asking if there were maps of the sand dunes as something they experienced more recently with someone called it the roaming sand dunes, as they like traverse and alter the land as they expand. So yeah, the idea of mapping a sand dune sounds as difficult as maybe mapping a flood. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Lucas, I really enjoyed hearing about the process of your work before your PhD studies and how that led to the research questions you have. Hannah, can you share a little bit about what led you to the work you're doing?
Yeah. So most of my like academic research background has been in remote sensing and satellite imagery. And for my master's, I was working on a project that I really enjoyed, but didn't really have the fieldwork component of it. Still kind of looking at human environment interactions, but never having that touch point with people. And that was something that I was really, especially like starting a PhD coming out of COVID, was like aching for, and wanted to have a project that did feel like it was having a soundboard with the communities that I was, mapping, quote unquote. And so, like the actual like topic of looking at blue tarps in Southwest Louisiana for this particular event was like pretty haphazard, and like how I came upon that, mostly kind of through I guess like string of coincidences of reading a news article really of talking about a family that had put a blue tarp on their home after Hurricane Ida happened, which was the first week when I started my PhD. And so that kind of like put a light bulb in my head about like, oh, can we map blue tarps using high resolution satellite imagery? And what does that say about who's recovering and who's not recovering? So yeah, I'd say it's, kind of like mostly a curiosity in thinking about how we can use these data products to expose, long-standing historical inequalities, but also, finding that that's not, enough and that really understanding what's going on requires talking to people, hearing their stories, knowing, kind of really like the processes and legacies that lead to what we're seeing in these maps. So what Lucas was saying about like the politics of, what claims you can make with a map, I think is we're really just like the field is just beginning to grapple with this question of like what kind of, truths can we say and, what other kind of forms of knowledge and information do we need to bring in to complement that?
One thing that strikes me as you all are talking has been kind of this, you all are going into satellite data for flooding or hurricane recovery, or going into the archives and looking at past data and then bringing that to partners, to community members. And I think there is a real power in then sharing these, databases and archives with people and then getting them to kind of interact with it. And yeah, I guess just kind of thinking if you have any examples or stories from how people have interacted with the data that you've presented, and how that maybe led to a change in your thinking or, you know, opened some other avenue for taking this work forward.
I can go first. I've been sitting on this particular memory, or I guess experience. I'm using memory as if it happened years ago, when it was actually like a couple weeks ago. But after I presented the about the 1930s land management reports, one community member came up to me and thanked me. And this isn't just to like pat myself on the back, but their comment was actually really interesting because they're one of the more knowledgeable individuals in my community that I know personally. And so they were like, thanks for this, mainly because most of the history that he talks about, he's a teacher, kind of goes up to the 1950s. And that's with the establishment of the school in the community. And so he says, we rarely get opportunities to like look at, documents from the 1930s that kind of give us an insight into just what was going on. And for those unfamiliar, it was these documents were produced in 1937 and 1938, after two forced livestock reductions where, the federal government imposed a livestock reduction on Dene people, the first being voluntary, and after that being imposed and involuntary. And so, he opened up in that discussion. I mentioned the CCC, which I believe is the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was during this time that they were really active in the Navajo Nation, like whether it was with engineering reports or the design and development of soil conservation experimentation labs. He mentioned that his father was part of that, and that through this presentation that it reminded him of it. And the funny story being that like before he would go off to work, he would say CCC to his horse, and that I guess that signaled to the horse we're going to work, which is like a very interesting way that this federal program interacted and manifested in the lives of Dene people, and was a memory for him growing up, and reflects just, I think, really helps contextualize these land management reports that I haven't experienced, but that the parents of the people that I presented to have. And I always thought that was pretty intriguing, mainly because as someone who's interested in Marxism, I'm really interested in how labor gets pulled into discussions about land and agrarian politics. And so just that little memory, reminded me and grounded me in kind of my approach to my research question about land is the importance of historicizing it. And as Lucas mentioned, the everyday experiences and memories that are associated with that. So, yeah.
I imagine too, a lot of those reports and documentation are very dry, but I mean, they're represent like the things that were actually happening at that time were not. And so kind of getting more of that lived experience and the like historical memory and like what that actually meant in those interactions, I think really, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe it's a way to, the reports offer a way for people to reflect and like add to a rich history of that time period, and then I get like what that means for practices now and land management practices.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Marley, your work is just really fascinating, and especially your work, I think, in the archive and sort of this, again, as you said, Gigi, I think archives can so often sort of be sort of boring on their head, but I think there's this concept that Emma Perez says about sort of the decolonial imaginary and sort of thinking through who built the archive, who is the archive built for, and what does it mean to sort of look between the archive to sort of get at a sort of a different kind of story. And I just think that's such a fantastic example of sort of thinking through the archive, even though it might have, was produced by a certain kind of person for a certain kind of reason, that it can still sort of, if we look through it and contextualize other people's lived experiences, it can still sort of, I think, be such a beacon source of I think, new ways of, new knowledges.
Do you see connections to your work, Lucas? Like kind of, I don't know, just or I don't know, maybe satellite imagery is not dry, but
Well, I mean, I guess in some ways my work is sort of thinking through people as archive, people's lived experiences. A lot of our work is, or a lot of work for the last year has been showing people flood maps that we make with satellite imagery and then saying, like, does this connect with your lived experience? Is this right? Is this wrong? And folks have a lot to say, which has been really, really great. Folks have a lot of opinions about where we're getting it right, and of course, very importantly, where we're getting it wrong, because that's how we sort of improve our maps and make them sort of better reflect folks' lived experiences. To answer, I think, answer the question sort of about, thinking through how people have responded to these maps. There was sort of one, I think, moment in particular where, there's a little bit of a concern here. I think it's this producing maps just for the sake of producing maps. Like there are also sort of some risks associated with that. Namely, what does it mean to sort of map a community? So literally put an informal community on the map, and to show that community is flooded and it has flood vulnerability and it floods repeatedly. What are the risks in terms of, the perspective or maybe ire of the state? What does it mean then to sort of have folks be mapped into being flood vulnerable, flood risk? What does it mean to then have those folks maybe have their property value diminished or to be uninsurable, or to sort of think through all of these things, right? What are those risks? And I think we try to be really cognizant of that. And the workshop we did a few months ago with folks and sort of shared some of our concerns as researchers and said, are you comfortable with this data being sort of shared and sort of publicly available? And the response we got was that our community partners did not share that same concern, that they were not as concerned about these risks that we had sort of thoughtfully sort of thought through as potential concerns. And they responded by saying that we're not worried because the county, the local government is complicit in the development of informal communities and flood vulnerable places. They know that this is a problem. So we're not the point of these maps from them, I think, from their perspective, is to sort of put it in the face of the government to say that, you've been complicit in this problem, you need to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting to hear, like, that we have these really careful assumptions that we try to carry with us going into the field and doing collaborative research that sometimes even though those are really well intentioned and are coming from a good place, are like not like misplaced, but kind of like outside of, just unaligned with what the response that you got, I think is really interesting, and curious to hear how you kind of like take that going forward of, figuring out how that will guide how you'll make maps in the future and what the motivations are for creating those. I think to the question that was posed about, yeah, how are community partners responding to what we're sharing or our findings? And in my case, I've found kind of like mixed reactions. Like, you don't need a satellite map of blue tarps to know that there's inequalities in recovery happening. Like, you can just drive around and see that. And so I think people's like first blush when they see something like that, see a map of a blue tarp, across the city is cool. That's like, we already know that. And is this really benefiting you, or is this benefiting us? And like having like hard conversations about like, what is the purpose of, a map? And yeah, I've, kind of like, I think like a through line through like all three of our experiences and projects is a deficit of information, overcoming that deficit. Is that really the goal? Or are we trying to, be more considerate of what our research is contributing to a community? And I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of like, oh, if I just like, pull these records together and put a map together and like fill these gaps, that is valuable in and of itself. And I think, at least from my case, like hearing that person's reaction of like, what is, is this just benefiting you as a researcher, has made me be more critical of kind of what the value of my research is. And I am still reconciling with that question.
Since before we move away from the topic of maps, I had a very interesting, similar to Lucas, where when in grad school we're taught to like be very critical of maps and their representations and their embeddedness and power relations. Where some of the responses I got were just simply like, "Can you map this for us?" Like, like we need to use this for development. Like in one of the maps, it showed areas where they were thinking of putting agricultural sectors, and community members are like, "That looks a lot like, you know, of our maps currently that we need for development." And so there was less of a cautionary, like, oh, who's making the maps, but just more of like a very practical reason, which, definitely informed me with my own future research about community mapping, maybe, and just still holding on to the cautionary politics of utilizing maps, but also like maybe just recognizing that some communities just really need a practical use of it. And, how do you go about that as a researcher? Is something I'm still trying to work out. I'm not familiar with map making or GIS, so I'm I'm just gonna have to draw a map. But that was something that did come across that really changed my expectations and assumptions of myself as a researcher, but also what I've been taught and how other people perceive mapping. And maybe just a more practical reason. So I do appreciate this. You're hearing both of you use this, and especially satellite imagery. I'm just fascinated by that.
I'm unsurprised that a group of geographers is now talking about maps.
It was bound to happen eventually.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in how, the three of you went into the field with like an idea of what your work was going to be. And by engaging with the local communities and understanding their stories and bringing in your first, like, your first maps or your first presentation of what your research is going to be, and how your research has changed because of that, and how, collaborative research gives you something different. I'm just wondering how that is guiding your research now. And has it changed your research?
I can jump in on that. I think the collaborative research and maybe just like doing field work and like doing interviews and talking to people, the like I've learned that, kind of what we were just talking about with like what is the value of a map and what does it provide that you can't get from just talking to people? I think having conversations with people, learning about why there's inequality in recovery has been really helpful for thinking about like, you know, and kind of like has actually shifted the research a bit from just looking at blue tarps on homes to like understanding why people take their insurance company to court and why people live in, airship properties, which means that they aren't required to have insurance, which means that when a storm happens, they oftentimes are, really exposed to uninsured losses. And so trying to like, I think the collaborative nature of the work and also just like doing the interviews has, you know, almost like shifted the blue tarp and mapping work to like the back seat of the project. And I think, I mean, definitely that would not have been the case had I not really been collaborating or talking with people and having that experience. And so it's been really valuable in that sense of, I think, enriching the project and actually making it a lot more impactful in terms of just like understanding the causes and reasons why there's inequality in recovery.
I think, share a little bit too on sort of how things have shifted. Um, I think that one thing that I have been grappling with, and I think it has not been like a sudden realization, but something that's sort of happened incrementally, is the reality that the community partners that I work with have really heterogeneous interests. They have really diverse levels of like technical capacity to sort of use geospatial data. And they have various structural limitations as it sort of relates to things like funding. Not everyone's a 501(c)(3), right? Not everyone, a lot of these organizations refuse to take federal money because of ethics. And so what does that mean and look like from sort of work on the ground? So I think one way that my work, I think, has really shifted in trying to be responsive and sort of think thoughtfully about, what we call participatory action research, or work that is ideally grounded in folks' their own sort of agendas and not mine necessarily, is thinking about, okay, how can I be responsive to two stakeholders, one of which, has a staff of say 50, 100 people and has a dedicated analyst on staff that can use GIS. Another one maybe is an organization of a dozen people, and they're struggling to have internet access, and they don't really respond to email, but like really the best form of communication is like WhatsApp. And I'm making maps with these people. And what does it mean then to sort of try to slot my work in to sort of meet their really diverse needs? And I actually don't have an answer to that. I can't say that like this is how we've addressed that issue, but really I can only say that this is an issue that is now on the forefront of my mind as I sort of move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just thinking about, I mean, in my collaborative work, I mean, there's just a lot of pivoting, constant, different challenges are coming up, and you kind of have to find some way to meet a particular need or do this thing. And yeah, as you said, everyone has different, um, uh, like internet capacities and or access to computers, or some people are in rural areas, some people are just all kinds of different stuff, and I think that can be a real challenge. Just on that topic of challenges and doing collaborative research, I'm curious what kinds of challenges did happen during this past year. Like, were there any main pivot moments where you just had to shift very suddenly, or you know come up with a different plan on the fly? What did that look like for you all?
Yeah, for me, I think one of the main challenges was logistics, and that being just finding a place to have these well, to have meetings where all of us are joined together versus what we were doing in the beginning, which was zooming in and occasionally calling each other just due to the signal and Wi-Fi issues that people had. But then when we wanted to meet in person, the physical aspect of like finding a space to host us and a lot of the bureaucracy of like you need insurance. And so like it kind of surprised me, even in the community that I'm from. Yeah, no, I thought my personal connections would afford me easy access or you know expedite my access. But I went through the bureaucracy like a lot of other people did, and that was in my own community. So for my PhD work, I'm definitely going to have to be a little bit more open to other areas. We were primarily meeting in the local chapter house, and so now I'm like, okay, I need to be more creative as to where we meet, and that might include churches, any other organizing spot that and maybe people's houses depending on the situation. But yeah, a lot of the challenges were mainly logistic and practical things. But as of my own, as a researcher, for sure the assumptions that I had and expectations I had regarding how people would react to the work was something very informative for me, specifically that despite the land management reports being produced during the livestock reduction, the soil water conservation district members still found it useful and wanted to make something useful out of it. And the tension that I noticed that was almost implicit was how do we take care of the land without a draconian livestock reduction? How do we, do that? Because we recognize that soil erosion is an issue. What are the political and technical solutions that we can offer that will not reproduce another livestock reduction? They were very attuned to the historical trauma that befell on people who witnessed their livestock being slaughtered in front of them and sold off. So that was definitely, and because of that, it informed the framing of the land question and their work with me as a soil conservation policy. And so that was very informative for me.
I just have a clarification question too. So the idea with reducing with livestock reduction and soil erosion is that having so much livestock on land is like eroding the soil.
Yeah, and then the soil that's eroded ends up in the Colorado River and it creates silt, which then threaten the Hoover Dam, and which then threaten the energy production of the West. And that's the general rationale behind that period in time and why Navajo people were Navajo livestock and their grazing practices were kind of deemed the issue and in need of intervention. So yeah, and the community members were very attuned to that livestock reduction, but they were unclear about the scientific rationale. And so when I discussed that with them in my presentation, they were they, in my opinion they were more understanding of a time period that is generally over. It's usually when they talk about the 1930s, it's just the livestock reduction, but rather than the actual land management and the scientific rationale behind it. So they were surprised by that.
Yeah, interesting those all those connections and like why certain policies were made have these much bigger contexts and reasons. And I think, yeah, it's difficult to know that whole big story without really
Right,
diving in.
right. And may I add one more thing? I
Yeah.
wanted to say this. The logistical problems, in my opinion, stemmed from the historical problems of land. So, like, they're interconnected. The issues that shape land development in the community also were the product of these land management surveys through a grazing regime and the development guidance and procedures. So yeah, I just wanted to, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, we got to connect it all back. Hannah or Lucas, any kind of similar thoughts or experiences?
I just wanted to quickly comment or really just build on what Marley said. I think again, I'm sort of just struck by the connections and similarities between our work. Um, I think one recurring theme that I really felt this year is this sort of, I guess, like the political ecology of like quote unquote backwardness, or sort of the way that like I think that historically marginalized, racialized communities and places are often, I think, onus is often like put on them. This is me on my political high horse. Onus feels like is often put on them as culprits. I think Marley, I feel like you sort of spoke about that just now in terms of like it's the fault of the Navajo for overgrazing, which is leading to all of these sort of metaphorically, but also literally sort of downstream problems. And I think in my context, folks are often informal, folks that live in informal settlements are often blamed for the flooding issue. They should never have lived there in the first place. This is their fault for living there. With, of course, ignoring the fact that there is no affordable housing. There's no place for them to live. And so it is sort of this really sort of tricky, contested thing where I think blame is often put on folks. And I've been thinking about this kind of all year on in terms of like who bears the brunt of responsibility. And I think it is something that I see as a theme throughout like a lot of different components of my research, and something that I've been just thinking about a lot recently. And so I just really appreciate you bringing that up, Marley.
Yeah, I think piggybacking off of that, I also see kind of different threads of that patterning in what I'm seeing here in Southwest Louisiana with these mostly racialized inequities in terms of access to legal remediation, and access to legal services to remedy, or even just like misrecognitions of capabilities to access or exercise legal rights when it comes to some sort of bad faith or, wrong that's been done to somebody, when it comes to insurance companies and, paying households out for damages that they've incurred. And so, yeah, that doesn't really get to the original question about challenges in collaborative research, but there's so many like questions of power and imbalances there that I think across all of our work is really important to highlight.
Yeah, sorry, I took that in a, in a different direction. I apologize.
I guess spinning off of that, what are what kinds of outputs do you feel like could come from your work or have come from your work that could, start to address some of those power issues or some of these kind of disparities or um, yeah, like what is the power of your work to kind of shift some of these?
I can say something to that. I think one thing that I've been trying to reframe in my work a lot, and especially over the last sort of 3 or 4 months, has been shifting, I think, from there's a few folks are sort of framing it in different ways, whether you call it sort of like a scarcity mindset or maybe like a mindset of like a vulnerability mindset, and sort of shifting that sort of like to a values or assets-based mindset when it comes to the work that I do. This sort of region at the very sort of southern tip of Texas is often described as sort of insert frame or insert sort of description of a poor of color place. It's predominantly Mexican and Mexican American, has one of the highest rates of poverty in the country, has poor public health outcomes, it has these informal colonias, and that you can sort of go on and on. And I think that is language that I think, unfortunately and sadly, is valuable in terms of getting a grant, but as I think is really problematic and painful and does a lot of damage as well. And so just in the last few months, I've sort of started to sort of think through what does it mean to sort of start talking about the Rio Grande Valley as a cultural heartland? What does it mean to sort of think of the Rio Grande Valley as this place where you have Chicanx, artists, writers, poets, thinkers, theorists, philosophers have really come out of this place. I mean, Gloria Anzaldúa being a famous example, and many, many, many other very well-known Chicane thinkers have come from the Rio Grande Valley. So what does it mean to sort of start from that place? Or start from the place of the valley having a very long history of organizing from that dates back to the United Farm Workers Union of Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and even, of course, before then, and sort of centering that history and then saying, this is a really fecund place of thought and of culture, and yet it also experiences environmental racism. And that manifests in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about Elon Musk and SpaceX, or we're talking about flooding, or we're talking about heat vulnerability. I mean, I think the list goes on and on, right? So how do we sort of talk about these things and sort of flip that conversation so it's not just from a point of lacking and not having enough, but really a point of like, no, like let's center, I think, this other thing, which is, I think, perhaps a small in scale move, but one that I try to embrace as sort of a way that I think reframe my work.
Yeah, I think there's lines of what you're saying there, Lucas, that kind of resonate with me as well. Like I think about there's been like some really great writing talking about, how do we not talk about communities as damaged, but talk about like what capabilities they have and what that means for a future for them. And like it is a reframing, and I think there's been too much discussion of, focusing on describing what we're seeing in the, I don't like just negative aspects and like not focusing on kind of what is the possibility and positive direction of that. The one thing I was gonna like respond to with the question is thinking about like how the work can, not necessarily like peel back these layers of imbalances in power and justice, but one part of the work that I have kind of shifted to is looking at records of where homes that are kind of designated as these heirship properties, so homes that aren't, they've been essentially passed down through generations, but aren't necessarily, the title on the home is not with the person who resides in the home, which can make it really hard to get insurance or cash an insurance check if you do have insurance. And so there's really amazing work with some legal aid services to provide estate planning, education to, people that are residing in these homes to actually get the succession transferred so they can get insurance and, insure their homes in the event of a future storm, which is inevitable. So I think that work has really been a focusing point for me to see like, okay, compiling these records on where these properties are located can help people identify, help legal services identify which properties could benefit from this really important thing. Something as simple as having a will in place so that they can access these, important financial resources like an insurance policy has been something I've been trying to kind of focus the work on more recently.
Yeah, in response to the question, I think for me, I'm so biased towards history. I'm like, everything needs to be historicized, mainly because a lot of what I did over was just archival research. And for me, like one of the most useful things that I've learned is just the importance of history. And particularly, as I mentioned with the previous anecdote with one of the community members talking about their memory of their parent going off to work, as well as just the fact that, to his knowledge, there wasn't a lot of information about the 1930s for the Tunalia community. And for me, that's been something that, when we were working with the research partners, they emphasized the historical importance of this information and how it shapes current land use issues, as well as the inequality I think a lot of contemporary Dene issues in the Navajo Nation occurred during the 1930s. It was a decade of what I would say like a big transformation for Dene people's agricultural and livestock practices as they entered into like the wage economy. And, so a lot of these issues kind of emerged from the 1930s. And so a lot of some responses that I got from the community members, with the use of maps, which was something that they found very interesting, was that a lot of those maps resembled their community land use planning maps. And they were like, "Oh, is this like did the people who made these maps in the early 2000s know about these?" And I honestly couldn't answer them. I was like, you know, it just sounds like maybe the community land use maps were produced from the historical living patterns of Dene over time, and it just happens to fit with the previous maps. And so that connected to me just the need to like historicize land relations and practices. And one of the things that we wanted to do in the presentations was emphasize land histories, and particularly who and where people lived. In these land management reports, they had names, and a lot of these names were recognizable to some of the community members. One of them being a former elected delegate that everybody was like, "Oh, I voted for that." Is that their parent, as well as the importance of just historicizing it. The other issue that they wanted to point out was not just who and where people lived, but also how the practices of Dene people were documented, and as well as their movement. Where were their concentrations of people? To them, these were all important aspects of Dene land history. And then, because these documents were written by non-Navajos, they wanted to emphasize the traditional geographies of that area and what the traditional names of these areas were. And we didn't necessarily engage in that, but through our conversations, through the presentations, people would they would refer to the maps in traditional names, refer to certain watering holes by their traditional names, which I thought was very fascinating because I didn't know that particular history. And I don't necessarily speak Navajo. And so a lot of this was very new to me. And a lot of it was something that I think a lot of the youthful community members would appreciate. So, yeah, that was what we were trying to do with the importance of like historicizing this information to kind of give a more whole account of the communities where these management reports were conducted.
Yeah, I think hearing all of you talk about this, it's really, I guess, just making me think of, the power of these relationships and like doing this collaborative work and building those relationships with people gives avenues for this research and these projects to actually have impact, whether that's changing the narrative, providing more historical context, helping people with very practical, like insurance and, like life issues. And to me, I mean, that's a real power of this kind of work. And yeah, it's just very apparent that that kind of has come up even in the last, I know your projects have extended beyond this past year, but just even in this past year of engaging with people, it's interesting to see how that, how it can shift, like the what this research can do and the impact that it can have can be really tangible and, you know, tangible, intangible, but like change. It can create some real tangible change. Yeah, are there other things that you all would want to touch on or they haven't really been able to bring up yet? Any kind of parting
I,
words or yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, my whole project was done to do archive work, and the community members really emphasized accessibility. And I mean, I think more recently with universities repressing student protesters, I often, think about because the community members didn't know that these documents existed at the U of A, at U of A Special Collections, that, how many Dene people actually have access to this. And in my case, I'm a student, so I could easily just kind of sign in and whatnot. But it does make me wonder, though, like, it questioned, with all the protests for, a free Palestine, and which is in itself a political framing of land dispossession and the history of it, of ethnic cleansing. For me, it became really pertinent as an Indigenous person, the need to, like, do teach-ins, which are, educating community members, either within our communities or, amalgamated of various communities, the kind of position that universities are with having these, like, documents that are very important for Indigenous people, and how, like, if there were a bunch of Native protesters, how they would get kicked out of universities and they would never have access to this and would not be able to, like, function as a conduit to make things accessible. So that's been something I've been struggling with recently, of just, like, how, as researchers, our positions of, particularly for me, because I think mine was making a lot of this accessible, this historical archival data accessible to the community, was just like, how do researchers then go into the university and, um, you know, pass it along to other people? I think for me, that was the question that was asked from the soil water conservation members of, can you, like, put this on a website, or can you send this? A lot of it was through zip drives and emails. And, now that universities are becoming a little bit militarized and calling in, militarized police forces, it does make me question what I think a lot of academics go through, of just, like, the university and how it is, in some ways, a ivory castle that is defended, and how Indigenous people who want to make an important impact via their research have to, like, navigate that. I think about a lot of Dene protesters who may get kicked out of school, and or may have been kicked out of school, and their research is stunted, or not stunted, but prolonged if they're allowed back in, because they, had they wanted to protest peacefully. So that's something more recently that I wanted to touch upon, just because, as an Indigenous person, but also someone who talks about land and the current politics, of, a settler colonial project going on globally. So yeah, that's what I wanted to address. That's also, like, a challenge that I'm having to reconcile my position in.
Yeah, I think not kind of directly related, but somewhat, on the question of data access and who has access and who doesn't have access. That's one thing I've also been thinking about, like, as a student, I've been afforded certain access to data sources that I otherwise would not have been if I was, you know, not outside of research and outside of academia. Like, I'm thinking particularly, there's the US federal court system has their online electronic data records that you otherwise have to pay for every single page that you access, which can be really costly if you're looking up dockets and, PDFs that have hundreds of pages in them. But as a researcher, you can access those with a fee exemption. And so that's something that, like, a community organization or, a nonprofit who's trying to understand who's been involved with civil litigation cases over insurance would have to pay for. And so there's I think, a particular onus that, kind of gets placed on, or, I'm placing on myself as a student and a researcher to, like, harness this data and have it be accessible to folks who otherwise couldn't, access it due to financial constraints. And so this project has definitely exposed a lot of the barriers that are in place to accessing data that you kind of have slippages through as being a student, and what that means going forward as we're all kind of, like, reaching the end of our graduate degrees.
I think some of us are closer to that finish line than others, Hannah. But yeah, no, I think just in sort of I've been thinking sort of about I would say sort of the privilege of being a researcher, the privilege of being a PhD student, having time dedicated to going through archives or combing through data. I'm reminded of my own quest over the last year and a half to sort of annoy FEMA over a FOIA request that I submitted in November of 2022 that was just filled 2 weeks ago. They gave me a CD, which I never have. I had to find a CD drive. That was its own sort of side quest. And sort of thinking through what is it, what I ended up doing was emailing FEMA essentially every week for a year and a half, and tracking that data down. And who has the capacity and time to do that? If not researchers. And if I think through, and when I shared this with community partners, I think their response was like, "This is so valuable. This is so helpful. Like this FEMA FOIA request could be really, really useful. Like, please send us the data." And of course, I did. But I think the question then becomes like these barriers, as I think both of you have already talked about, these barriers to entry are so real. And I think the tension is that I think researchers are often we're often put in positions of go-betweens, especially if I think if we're a member of the community that we're also studying alongside or researching alongside, we're sort of put in this almost like a cultural broker between these sort of spaces. And I think that for me, I feel a sense of responsibility to those communities, but also, I think it's really important just to, I think what Hannah and Marley have already done, which is sort of criticize how these institutions are really inaccessible.
I guess, yeah, just building off of that, what would you say to graduate students or other researchers who are wanting to do collaborative research and, kind of, I guess I could go anyway, navigating some of these barriers or, really lessons that you learned that have made this work easier on you. But just yeah, for all this, there's a lot more interest in like doing this kind of work, which is really great. But, yet these very huge like institutional barriers exist. And for a lot of reasons because they don't always want change to happen, So, and there is a lot of pushback, but I've been very inspired by the work that you all have done and that other uh, collaborative researchers are doing. And I'm excited to see what can happen with that. So yeah, just what advice would you have for people who are either embarking on this or in the midst of it themselves?
I for me, I think as one lesson that I've always had to relearn and learn in new ways and in different contexts is to be humble. I think as researchers, we read a lot of theory. We are able to have access to a lot of tools and really really smart folks, and that may tend to give us a sense of superiority, I suppose. But I think for me, the thing I always learn is to be humble and to be that is to like to be open to the other framings and meanings of the people that you work with and their needs, to be responsive to that. I'm always fascinated by whatever project I'm working on, the ways that my expectations and assumptions differ from theirs, even in the intended goals, as well as just what I thought they needed. So that's an assumption there. And each time I do get more flexible, and it's always, when you're writing any project report and they ask you to like, oh, what are your goals? What are this? You kind of like, oh, I want to do this. But by the end of the project, you're like, did I even do that? Or, does it even, so then you like feel a little bit weird about it. But yeah, that was definitely something I've had to learn with doing this. I didn't really expect there to be a whole lot of emphasis on presentations and community advocacy on behalf of my research partners. I was thinking maybe it'd be more involved with some policy talking to council delegates, and those involved with issues related to land and soil conservation. So I was really surprised that they preferred that I work on education and making and coming up together with guidelines for presentations, to which I'm probably better suited for. Maybe they saw something in that. I don't know. Maybe they're like, you're not going to interact well with people in power. So how about you just talk to community members and we'll do that. So, which is something they have been doing. They've been, the soil and water conservation districts have their own going ons right now of creating internal policies. And so, so they're reforming themselves. And so a lot of that was not what I expected. I thought maybe I was going to be more involved with community engagement. I'm not community engagement, policy related stuff and have access to that. But I'm perfectly fine doing what they suggested. Actually, I find it more interesting, because generally a lot of these community members don't hear this history, but also they have very interesting assumptions and expectations as well that me and a lot of the SWCD community members didn't expect. So yeah, and all of that to package that is just to be humble and go with the flow as well as you can.
Yeah, I want to build on this idea of humility, I think, because I think for me this last year, I've really struggled with humility and being humble. And I don't mean that from a sort of me being egotistical, but rather I think this idea that I think I have been really attached to, which is that I should have all the answers, that I should know what I'm doing, which of course is an impossible task. And so I think when I was confronted with the fact that I didn't have all the answers, and when I was confronted with the idea that I was uncertain about the next step, it felt, I think, like a failing or a failure. So I think for me, humility has multiple definitions. And I think another definition might be like also just letting go, releasing the idea of having all the answers. And I think I still haven't successfully done that, but I think I hopefully have made steps toward that. And I think that's been really valuable just in terms of, as you said, Marley, being open to other ways of knowing, for folks' different sort of perspectives.
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I feel like every day, like there's a new lesson learned or like new challenge that you like didn't anticipate. And so there's a lot of little things. But I think one main thing that stands out to me is and this relates to the humility aspect of it, I think, is that there's already this network and relationships built amongst community organizations and residents that are pre-existing before, at least like in my case, before I showed up. And some of those are good relationships and some of those are more delicate relationships, and understanding how to navigate that and not let those pre-existing connections kind of get in the way of me making and forging connections with groups that, maybe don't necessarily work together, but I would like to individually have connection with each of them. And so I think that's been, has been like an emotional hurdle for me to like work through, of like not letting that get in the way of me still making myself known and valuable as a researcher and like connector between groups. And so a big part of that has been the humility, the cultural humility that comes with understanding your role in relationship and just reading the room of like, okay, maybe I should, remove myself from this this situation or not. So I think it's a constant challenge of reflection and trusting your intuition.
Thank you all for sharing your research with us and your time and everything that you've learned over the past year. I know for listeners, we will have some blog posts that our fellows have written up in the show notes. So we have a couple of them, so that the first one introduces the project, and then the second one is more reflective and like things that have happened over the year. So definitely invite everyone to check those out. As well as, if you are something that you heard resonated and you want to reach out to one of these students, we'll have some contact information there as well. But yeah, any other parting thoughts from y'all?
I was gonna say thanks for hosting this great conversation. And it's always like so fun to talk about our work, Marley and Lucas, and I wish that Talia could join us.
Yeah, I wanted to say thanks, as well as I'm excited for the work of the other fellowship members because, hearing their work over a year, as well as just the cool methodologies and the use of satellite imagery is just fascinating to me that I'm excited to read it, and I think it's very promising.
Yeah, no, it's been really fascinating to see all your work evolve over the past year, and I'm excited to see where it all goes. So thank you all for a great year and a great discussion.